Hi guys, my name is Gabriella Young and I will be reviewing my PowerPoint discussing the nexus of transnational organized crime and terrorism, implications for global and U.S. homeland security. Over the past few decades, we've seen something pretty troubling, which is the world of TOC, which is transnational organized crime, I'll be referencing more, and terrorism, once studied as completely different problems, separate problems, and are starting to overlap. These aren't just isolated situations anymore, they're working together, so that's creating a hybrid threat that eventually can take advantage of our global networks, corruption, and cause weak governance. In this PowerPoint, we'll look at how these groups connect, the kinds of security risks that come from their collaboration, and the strategies, both operational and policy making, that can hopefully counter them. I'll be using our textbook a lot as a reference, which is the Evidensky and the Albanese and Rachel, along with more recent research and even ethical perspectives, including a Christian worldview. Understanding this nexus isn't just an academic exercise. It's really important to establish in order to build adaptable security measures in today's world. By the end of the PowerPoint, I hope there's a clearer picture of the relationship between TOC, again, transnational organized crime, and terrorism, and some practical takeaways for law enforcement, policymakers, and communities worldwide. So the first slide is basically discussing the introduction of TOC and terrorism. So we have to understand the fundamental definitions and characteristics of TOC and terrorism. So according to Evidensky 2017, TOC refers to a highly structured criminal groups that engage in unlawful activities across national boundaries. So these organizations typically pursue profit through illegal means, such as trafficking, drug and human trafficking, arms smuggling, cybercrime, and financial fraud. They're super secretive and super well organized and adaptive. So they're often using violence and threats to protect their own interests. Terrorism is generally understood as the use or threat of violence against civilians to achieve political, ideological, or religious goals. Our textbook explains that terrorist groups use fear as a weapon, often targeting both physical safety and psychological stability of these populations in order to draw out their causes or pressure governments into action. Although both of these motivations of TOC and terrorism seem different, for example, greed versus ideology, they're actually increasingly exploiting each other's resources and capabilities. So, for example, there are terrorist groups that may traffic drugs or launder money through TOC networks to fund their operations, which means that the organized crime groups might take advantage of the instability caused by the terrorism to expand their influence. So the globalization of trade, finance, and technology has only made both TOC and terrorism more agile and far-reaching. Evidensky also notes that these groups now operate in transnational space, leveraging both digital tools, weak legal systems, and porous borders to expand their influence, unfortunately. So understanding this overlap is very important to us both globally and through U.S. Homeland Security. The interconnection between the two complicates both detection, can disrupt traditional criminal justice framework, can necessitate a new integrated response from policymakers, law enforcement, and civil society. If we fail to understand how these threats interact, then we can often potentially risk implementing ineffective strategies that address the symptoms rather than the root cause of the actual challenge between TOC and terrorism. So in this slide, we're going to have a little overview of the TOC terrorism nexus. Um, so this refers to the operational convergence of TOC and terrorist organizations coming together. While they have operated independently, like we said before, they're both evolving security landscapes, have led to increased collaboration between the two, which can often blur the lines between profit-driven crime and ideology-driven violence. This relationship often manifests in shared logistical infrastructures. Criminal organizations possess well-established smuggling networks, expertise in money laundering, and access to the black markets. Terrorist groups facing increasing financial constraints due to sanctions and global counterterrorism efforts now partner with these crime syndicates to gain access to needed resources. So in return, unfortunately, criminal groups benefit from this, and they often cause more conflict between the two. However, so for example, one example of this is convergence in the Hezbollah's involvement in drug trafficking and money laundering in Latin America. So these operations help fund political violence elsewhere. And for those who don't know what Hezbollah is, it's an Islamic political and militant group based in Lebanon. Another example is Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So both of these groups have profited from oil smuggling and human traffic facilitated by local criminal networks. These relationships tend to complicate the traditional law enforcement model, which often separates counterterrorism and organized crime. So Khan and Lee, 2022 article, argue that this separation is outdated and ineffective. It fails to disrupt the underlying infrastructure, and there needs to be new strategies. So there's strategic advantages of this nexus include shared safe havens, co-opted government officials through corruption, and diversified income streams that can make both groups more resilient. So disrupting one element of the network without addressing the other will allow this cycle to continue. So therefore, understanding and targeting both TOC and terrorism nexus is essential for more effective countermeasures. So this may require multi-agency response at the international level, combining intelligence sharing, anti-money laundering strategies, border control, and cyber defense, all while addressing the root causes that enable these groups to thrive. All right, so the first slide, this one is discussing potential leakages regarding illicit supply chains and logistics. So one of the main ways organized crime and terrorist groups connect is through supply chains and logistics. So think of it like an organized crime network that's been running smuggling routes for years. They know which borders are weak, which officials can be bribed, and which back roads avoid checkpoints. So instead of creating their routes, terrorist groups often use these already established channels because it's easier, faster, cheaper, and less risky. These networks don't just move one type of illegal item. The same truck, boat, or hidden tunnel that transports drugs in 1 week might move guns or even people the following week. So by sharing these transportation systems, both criminals and terrorists save money, keeping their operations flexible, and it makes harder for authorities to predict who and what is moving where. So this system expands terrorist groups' ability to reach even further than what they're doing. So all of a sudden they can transport weapons and cash, and then there's people they can transfer. So it's far beyond their usual territory. It's like giving them an international courier service, but for illegal goods. It's pretty awful. But the problem for law enforcement is that these supply chains blur the line. So you might have a cargo ship that looks legitimate on paper, but inside could be weapons or explosives. Or another example could be a route used for smuggling drugs, could also be used to move people with dangerous intentions. When organized crime and terrorism team up on logistics, it's a win-win for them, which often is a nightmare for investigators and law enforcement. It expands their reach, hides their activities, and keeps both groups well supplied without having to reinvent the wheel. So another potential linkage is shared financial networks and corruption. So they're not just sharing smuggling routes, they're also plugged into the same financial pipeline. So one of the biggest overlaps is money laundering. Criminal networks have been moving dirty money through banks, shell companies, informal systems like Hawala for decades. Terrorist groups can tap into those existing systems to move their funds without drawing too much attention. It's kind of like a washing machine for illegal cash, just with different stains. So corruption plays a huge role here. In some countries, there are officials that just turn a blind eye for exchange for money, or even actively helping these groups move money and resources. So when this happens, TOC and terrorist operations can operate much more freely because law enforcement is essentially turning a blind eye. So instead of worrying about getting caught, they have insiders making this a lot smoother for them. Weak institutions and governance make this problem worse. So if a government has poor oversight, weak banking regulations, or unstable political leadership, this is often more of a safe haven for these kinds of activities. So in these environments, the nexus between crime and TOC grows stronger because they're not being stopped. It's not about moving money either. These financial networks help groups pay for everything else they need, from weapons to recruitment to propaganda. And because of the transactions, they're often hidden among legitimate business deals they can go, which allows them to go unnoticed for years. So essentially, when organized crime and terrorist groups share financial channels and benefit from corruption, they become harder to track, harder to stop, and much more dangerous. They basically are turning global economic systems, or at least part of it, into a tool for sustaining their operations. So in this slide, we will be talking about transnational crime's role in terrorism financing. So terrorist organizations rely on multiple revenue streams. One of the most significant source comes from their connections to TOC. These linkages often center around illicit economies, particularly the drug and human trade, where established criminal networks have already been infrastructured routes and contacts to generate substantial profits. Terrorist groups may tax shipments moving through their territory, partnering directly with traffickers, or in some cases manage portions of the trade themselves. And also human trafficking operates the same way. So whether it involves smuggling, labor, or facilitating other sort of exploitation, the networks that move people across borders are highly profitable. So terrorist actors can embed themselves within these systems very easy, either as beneficiaries or facilitators, using the proceeds that they make to fund their operational needs. So once illicit funds are generated, they must be laundered to appear legitimate. This may involve front companies, real estate transactions, informal value transfer systems such as Hawala, like we said in the previous slide, or the misuse of charitable organizations. The same laundering channels that hide profits from organized crime are frequently leveraged to discreetly funnel resources to terrorist networks, allowing them to operate across borders without even being detected. The bigger impact is particularly acute in fragile states. So the influx of illicit funds into unstable regions fuels corruption, erodes governance, causing weak governments. And this eventually causes a cycle where instability facilitates criminal and terrorist activities, and those activities in turn further destabilize the state. So overall, Transnational crime functions as a financial enabler for terrorism, providing the means to acquire weapons, train personnel, conduct operations, and disseminate propaganda. It's important that addressing this nexus also requires coordinated strategies that target both, again, the criminal and the terrorist dimensions at the same time. So the connection between organized crime and terrorism isn't local or a regional problem anymore. It is absolutely a global problem. So one of the most serious effects is how it undermines states' sovereignty and the rule of law. When these groups gain power, they can bribe, intimidate officials, control parts of a country, and make their own rules. This often can weaken a government's ability to enforce any laws or even protect its citizens. These networks also fuel conflicts and political instability, particularly in vulnerable regions. Criminal profits can be used to buy weapons, pay fighters, and prolong conflicts much longer than they otherwise would. In some cases, this money enables groups to challenge governments directly or seize territory, creating dangerous power vacuums. The instability can easily spread across borders, dragging other countries into the crisis. Another major challenge is international cooperation. So overcoming this issue requires countries to share intelligence by working together, close legal loopholes, and coordinate investigations. But obviously this is easier said than done. Differences in laws, priorities, and trust between nations can obstruct joint efforts because we're not all seeing eye to eye with other countries and nations. So criminal and terrorist groups exploit these gaps, moving across borders or laundering money where oversight is weaker. So the crime-terror nexus pressures governments, destabilizing entire regions and making this even more difficult to fight. Addressing it involves not just targeting the groups themselves, but fixing systemic flaws, corruptions, poor governments, and weak international cooperation that enable their growth. So when we're considering the crime-terrorism link, it's not just something that happens over there. It has direct effects to the United States' homeland security. One of the main issues is how these networks exploit gaps in border security. So whether that be at land crossings, ports, airports, they are actively looking for weak points where they can smuggle drugs, weapons, people, or cash without detection. Sometimes it's just a small vulnerability, a poorly monitored checkpoint, a gap in surveillance, but if they can use it repeatedly, it'll become a reliable channel for that illegal activity. We can't ignore cybercrime either, so criminal groups are becoming increasingly sophisticated online, hacking into systems, stealing data, committing fraud, and even threatening infrastructure. Roberts, in an article in 2023, notes that some of these cyber tools are either shared with or sold to terrorist groups, giving them the ability to disrupt financial systems, spread propaganda, or launch cyber attacks without ever setting foot in the country. This kind of threat is harder to detect and doesn't rely on physical borders at all, since it is cybercrime. All of this puts serious strain on law enforcement resources, so agencies must address traditional crimes, cyber threats, and terrorism at the same time. Another 2019 article discusses how this might require constant political policy updates, trainings, reallocating manpower to different priorities. Every time the threat landscape changes, whether that's a new smuggling method or a new cyber attack method, agencies have to adapt quickly. The challenge is that the crime-terrorism nexus isn't static. It's adaptive and always looking for the next weakness to exploit. This means Homeland Security efforts cannot focus solely on one front. They need a layered approach that combines border security, cyber defense, intelligence sharing, and community cooperation. Without those things, we are at risk of falling behind in a fight where the other side is always innovating. To counter this problem, agencies need to think bigger than just arresting individuals, because the real goal is dismantling the entire network. If you only take out one person, the rest of the operation can keep going. So if you break the links between people, money, and logistics, you can shut the whole system down. Again, easier said than done, but one of the most effective tools for this is intelligence sharing and joint task forces. When federal, state, and local and international partners share what they know and coordinate their actions, they can connect the dots much faster and take decisive, coordinated action. These partnerships can also prevent duplicate efforts and help law enforcement cover gaps that criminals might otherwise exploit. Another key is improving international legal frameworks. So again, Albanese and Rachel stress the need for countries to align their laws, close loopholes, and strengthen extradition agreements. Right now, in many of these cases, criminals and terrorists can simply cross a border and find protection in a country with weaker enforcement. So communication and collaboration is key. So better cooperation between the nations makes it much harder for these groups to hide or move resources. Finally, local communities play a critical role. So Tyler and O'Brien, 2019, discussed that when law enforcement builds trust through community policing and fair, respectful treatment, residents are more likely to share tips, report suspicious activity, and work alongside officers. That kind of grassroots cooperation can stop threats before they grow into something bigger. Bottom line is that defeating the crime-terrorism nexus requires action at every level, from the neighborhood to the international stage. It's about closing gaps, building trust, and working together so these networks have fewer opportunities to operate and fewer places to hide. As we know, technology is becoming one of the most powerful tools now, but also in the fight against the crime-terrorism nexus. AI and data mining can scan massive amounts of information from financial transactions to social media activity and spot suspicious patterns much faster than a human could. Robert's 2023 study notes that these systems can connect seemingly unrelated events, helping investigators see the bigger picture and respond before a threat escalates. For example, a flagged money transfer in one country could be linked to a suspicious travel record in another, revealing coordination. However, technology isn't just a solution, it's also a challenge. So criminals and terrorists are using cyber tools to commit fraud, steal sensitive data, and disrupt infrastructure. A study by Lee in 2022 discusses that these cybercrimes can target both global networks and U.S. Homeland Security systems, making it harder to defend. The digital battlefield is constantly shifting, and staying ahead requires constant upgrades, new cybersecurity strategies, and specialized expertise. That's why it's super important to integrate technology into law enforcement training and operations. Johnson and Brown 2023 study emphasized that officers need not only the right tools, but also the skills to use them effectively, whether that's analyzing data, running cyber forensics, and operating surveillance systems. A strong investment in technology paired with well-training personnel ensures agencies can respond quickly and accurately to evolving threats. So when we're looking at the Holy Bible and from a Christian worldview, addressing organized crime and terrorism isn't just about punishment, it's about the balance between justice and mercy. So the Bible calls believers to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly. That was Micah chapter 6, verse 8, and Matthew chapter 5, verse 9 discusses that we are to be peacemakers. Proverbs 21:15 also reminds us that when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers, showing that upholding the law can serve us both morally and can also be a deterrent. So these principles really encourage policies that are firm in upholding the law while still compassionate towards victims and even offenders seeking change. This approach acknowledges the human dignity of all individuals, even those who've been harmed, while still holding them accountable. Forgiveness and reconciliation can be a powerful healing tool. Abedinsky also and the scriptures from the Holy Bible point to the value of restoring relationships where possible, especially for individuals that are caught up in crime through coercion or desperation. This doesn't mean ignoring justice, but it does mean creating opportunities for change, rehabilitation, and eventually reintegrating back into society. Our textbook also suggests that ethical policy reform should reflect both compassion and a commitment to security. Peace-building measures such as education, job programs, and dialogue can work in tandem with law enforcement to address the causes of crime and violence. So when justice is combined with compassion, societies often feel safer without compromising their morale or ethical foundations. So on the last slide, I will discuss challenges and future directions. Looking ahead, there are some major challenges to address. One is systemic corruption and lack of trust in institutions. So Patel and Singh 2024 note that without transparency and accountability, both crime and TOC can flourish. Corruption not only enables criminal activity, but it also erodes public trust, making communities less willing to work with law enforcement or government agencies. Another challenge is striking a balance between security and civil liberties. Tyler and O'Brien 2019 emphasized that overly aggressive policies can actually erode public trust and infringe upon rights, making cooperation with law enforcement much more difficult in the long run. So finding that balance is really critical, as security measures that alienate citizens can actually enhance the appeal of extremist narratives. So making sure that combating the crime-terrorism nexus requires interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral approaches. John and Brown 2023 highlight that this means bringing together law enforcement, intelligence agencies, policymakers, community leaders, and even private industry to share expertise and resources. So combining all of these factors together. So by fostering collaboration across sectors and disciplines, we hope to develop creative solutions that address both the symptoms and the causes of TOC and terrorism. The future of this fight depends on building strong partnerships and ensuring that strategies protect both public safety and fundamental freedoms. So that is the end of the slideshow. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. If you have any feedback, also feel free to comment as well. Thank you guys.